Hello and welcome everybody to the first TILE seminar in the academic year 23-24. I'm welcoming you all today to talk by Dr. David Playfoot on useful feedback is fair, nice feedback isn't useful. David is a senior lecturer in psychology at Swansea University, and his background is in cognitive processes involved in reading and word recognition. He has also published papers concerning memory processes. In recent years, he has been increasingly interested in the application of cognitive theory to teaching practice in order to improve student degree outcomes. He's a co-founder of the new Student Wellbeing and Outcomes Research Network, SWORN, at Swansea University. I welcome you, David, today to the talk. Again, as always, you can use the chat to ask questions, to leave comments, to share resources, and David will be picking up any questions in the end. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Here we go, and then hand over to David.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody else for being here as well. Thanks for allowing me to come and talk to you. I didn't realize it was going to be the first one of the academic year for you, and although I should have probably figured that out based on the time of year that we're at. So now I'm feeling a bit more pressured to set the bar nice and high for everybody else who follows. Yes, I'm going to talk about some studies that we've done recently. I say recently, it's been this is the culmination of kind of 4 years worth of data collection and planning and so on. And I'm going to describe 4 studies, one done each year, which are related to feedback and the feedback that we give to students on written assignments, and importantly, what they think of it and whether they're going to actually use it. So I'm sure it's I've used the word we several times already, so I'm here doing the talk, but these are my colleagues who are also involved in this project. Ruth Horry, who's with me here in Swansea, and Amy Pink, who was in Swansea when we started but now works out in Singapore and chips in from over there. So it's not a solo endeavor. I'm taking the credit today, but these 2 people deserve the credit more so than I probably. Right, I'm just going to move my little bar so that I can see what I'm doing. There we go. So we're talking about feedback, and as I'm talking to people who are in the TILE network, I'm sure I don't need to remind you that feedback is an integral part of the learning process. So we get students to do things, we tell them how they did on that task and how they can improve. I'm sure I also don't have to tell you that actually doing that feedback, providing that information, is very time consuming, and it takes us a lot of effort. And we do these things in order to provide the best possible kind of assistance that we can to our students. We spend a lot of time and effort doing these things. They don't necessarily like what we do. And again, I'm sure that this is not news to the people in this room. The amount of time and effort that we spend is often not fruitful in or recognized then in ratings of things like feedback efficacy and feedback helpfulness in our module review systems, or in kind of broader program level, course level feedback that we get from our students. In fact, it's not just that feedback isn't always viewed as useful by our students. Quite often it's not viewed at all. And this paper that I've cited, by the way, as we go through, there's going to be lots of citations that are in grey. They're there if you want them, but I'm not going to be saying names most of the time, partly to save my own blushes for getting names wrong. But this particular study looked at the used kind of data from learning management systems to determine how many pieces of feedback, uploaded feedback files, were viewed by the students on a range of courses at this particular institution. And it was only about, or there was about 38% of feedback that wasn't viewed at all by the students who it was supposed to help. And obviously, if they don't look at it, it's not going to help them. As a kind of slight aside, or a personal context, this kind of program of research was prompted in part by a particularly poor uptake of feedback on one of my modules. So I teach the second year research methods and statistics stuff for the undergraduate programs, and they do 4 kind of little practical reports in the style of journal articles across the year. The year before I started this program of research, the 4th of those things, the last practice they get before doing their big dissertation that's worth the most of their whole degree, the actual access rate for the feedback was about 28%. So 28% of the students actually bothered to read their feedback, which, I did the maths, that equated to something like 50 odd hours of staff time that was completely wasted because the students didn't bother reading the feedback afterwards. They got the number, they got the grade, and that was it. They didn't bother looking at any further than that. So we do this feedback. It takes us a lot of time. It's not necessarily viewed. When it is viewed, performance doesn't necessarily improve on the back of it, because it's not enough simply to view the feedback. You have to then act upon it. So that's the kind of feedback context that we're working in. And it's important for us as educators because we want our students to learn and to improve. But it's also important to us as kind of employees of universities because of the NSS. And the NSS, for anybody who isn't working in the UK and isn't familiar with it, is a large student survey that is conducted for final year undergraduates. And it basically asks them to rate various things about their course over the last 3 years, the entire duration of studying that subject. And ratings are then kind of amalgamated and league tables come out, and there's funding that is related to it and advertising that you are top 10 in the country for student satisfaction or things like that. It makes a big difference to your intake for the year afterwards. The NSS includes a section that is entirely devoted to assessment and feedback. Those questions have changed in the last academic year, but when we started, the questions included these 2. I've received helpful comments on my work, and marking an assessment has been fair. So we've got fairness and helpfulness, 2 things that are kind of covered in the title of this talk as being key parts of feedback as identified by the NSS. The new versions of the questions have been rephrased, but they still talk about helpfulness and fairness in relation to the feedback that has been received on work. So what we're coming at then is a situation where we do a lot of provision of feedback. Not only does it not appear to be being very helpful because students aren't improving, but also it's being rated as not particularly fair often by the students themselves as well. And that has implications for both our kind of practice and for our wider institutions. Now, the questions that we had when we embarked were, what exactly, these things are important questions, evidently, because they're in the NSS, but has anybody really determined what helpful means? And has anybody determined what is considered fair by students? So this is what we were trying to get at. Can we figure out what students consider to be helpful and consider to be fair, so that the feedback that we provide can be more useful to them and more likely to be acted upon, less likely to be ignored? essentially. That's where we were coming at this from. So as I said, I'm going to talk about 4 different studies that were conducted over the last 4 academic years. Just for context, as I said, I run the second year statistics things. The first statistics assignment of each year is based on data that we have collected from our students in that class, based on what do you consider to be helpful feedback, what do you consider to be fair. So that's why these have taken 4 years. They're the first thing that we do in kind of October every year, 4 consecutive cohorts of undergraduate students. Okay, so studies 1 to 3 are very similar, which is why I'm going to talk about them as a group. When we went into those studies, what we were interested in is what characteristics of the feedback that is provided might affect what is considered to be helpful or not. And as I've said, in order for feedback to work, it's not enough just to have it. You have to do something with it. It's kind of, feedback is like a gym membership. Just simply buying that gym membership and being able to walk in at any time and do a workout doesn't mean you're going to get any fitter unless you actually actively go and do something in that gym. So in order to act upon your feedback, you need to understand what it means, and it needs to have some kind of direction to it. Like it needs to tell you what to do. So this is known from the literature that students like feedback that is clear and that is constructive. And so we included clarity and constructiveness as variables within our study. In addition to being actionable and giving you information that will allow you to act upon the feedback, you also have to want to act on the feedback. And what I'm getting at there is that often there is an emotional response to getting the feedback in the first place. Okay, I'm sure we're all aware of that as well. Having had feedback on things of our own, often the first reaction is defensiveness, and this person doesn't know what they're talking about. I'm talking about the fabled reviewer too, of course, here. So when they write their feedback on your papers, the first thing that I certainly always do is read through it and assume that they haven't read the paper properly, or that they were not thinking straight, or that they were having a bad day or something, and it's not actually anything to do with me. So my first response is not wanting to act upon it. It's not my fault. Again, the literature tells us that I'm not the only person who reacts like this. It's been demonstrated that students are less likely to use overly critical feedback, and that positively kind of worded, positively framed feedback is more likely to lead to some kind of effort to change the way that the students approach tasks. But it's important to note as well, though, that overly positive feedback might not change behavior. So if you're too effusive in your feedback, students are likely to go, I'm doing grand, I don't need to worry about changing these little things that also are in there. I'm generally on the right track. So there's a balance to strike there in terms of the way that you phrase your feedback, so that it's not overly critical, it's not overly positive. And that kind of foreshadows what I'm going to say later on in probably about half an hour's time. So there's an emotional response to feedback, which we measured and has been measured in the literature as variously supportiveness or encouragement or kind of motivational value, or just general tone of positive versus negative framing. So again, we included those as variables within studies 1 to 3. I should also mention, actually, that I've listed clarity and constructiveness. You'll notice that the slides and the NSS question relates to helpfulness. And as it happens, helpfulness tends not to be something that is represented in the literature as a variable at all. So we also asked about that. So those are kind of characteristics of feedback comments that we are interested in and that have been demonstrated to be important in the literature as well. The other thing that we did in studies 1 to 3 is kind of change slightly the way that we measured what good feedback was. So in general, the literature does one of two things. It measures the preferences of students. So can you bring in an example of some feedback that you really liked and an example of some feedback that you really didn't like? And then that kind of thing is analyzed to kind of examine what common words or common themes are in that feedback in each of those two regards. The other way that feedback has been examined as being good or not is whether it elicits an improvement in grade. So that's actually quite a nice way of doing it if you can, but as we know as educators, there's a vast array of different things that can impact how well somebody does on a given bit of work, and therefore being able to pinpoint exactly the impact of written feedback on a written assessment on the next piece of work is quite difficult to do. I prefer that way. It's a bit more objective, but it's difficult. So a lot of research measures preferences of students. What feedback do you like? But of course, we know that preference for things doesn't necessarily mean action. Students, and it's not necessarily good for them either. So students will, I'm sure, again, I'm not alone in this. When we returned to campus after COVID, students were really keen to, if they could, avoid going and sitting in an exam hall again. And there's a lot of kind of pedagogically good reasons for not going down that route potentially, but their preference basically was it isn't such a nice way of doing assessment as doing it online via MCQ tests or open book exams. So there's a preference there, which comes from a reasonable place, but it's not necessarily the most useful in terms of learning and growing and developing your knowledge and your skills in a particular area. So preferring a type of feedback doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be more likely to be used. And so the way that we measured feedback efficacy or goodness in our studies was to ask students about a hypothetical intention to use. So here's a feedback comment. If you received this on your work, how likely would you be to refer back to it when you do your next piece of work? So there we are. It's an intention. Obviously, we can talk about whether intention is the same as action in the same way we can talk about whether preference is action. But that's what we went with to measure the likelihood that it would be actioned. Okay. In studies 1 to 3, as I said, they're very similar. So a lot of the design overlaps. And so I can talk about a bunch of it all at once. And then I'll present a slide in a few slides' time that tell you what makes study 1 distinct from study 2, distinct from study 3. In all 3 of the studies, we provided a survey to undergraduate psychology students starting their second year. And on that survey, they were presented with 40 feedback comments. So these are the kind of Turnitin inline comments that you can add, specific kind of highlighting of a passage or a sentence and saying something about that sentence. Each, as I said, student saw 40 comments, but because we wanted to be able to survey about a range of different comments, we actually created 4 different versions of the survey. So when students started the questionnaire, they were randomly assigned to one of 4 groups of comments. 20 comments appeared in all 4 versions. We refer to those now as core comments. And the reason that we've got those is so that we can see whether people in each of those 4 randomly allocated groups are interpreting the scales in roughly the same way. So because every participant sees those, we can correlate across groups and see how reliable the scales are in their usage. Each participant also saw a different set of 20 comments. So group 1 had the 20 core plus a group of 20. Group 2 had a 20 core plus a different group of 20, etc., etc. In total, therefore, we had 100 comments that were rated across all of our participants. And the assumption was that the 20 core comments would reveal that this was being done reliably, and therefore we could assume that the ratings of the other 20 non-core comments was representative of the whole student group, rather than just being limited to that one randomly allocated group of participants. Within those surveys, the comments themselves appeared in a random order per participant, so we hopefully didn't get any kind of boredom effects going on there. And also so that things weren't rated necessarily relative to the one that had gone before. You can imagine that if there was a feedback comment that was particularly good, and then the next one wasn't quite as good, it might appear worse in comparison. So by randomizing them, we didn't have a systematic effect of order in that way. So the participants saw these comments, and they were asked to provide 8 different ratings of various characteristics. We used semantic differential scales, which were these. So we've already talked about the intention to use feedback outcome variable for these studies. That ranged from not at all likely to use to very, very likely to use. The other 7 variables, our predictor variables, then were tone, helpfulness, clarity, constructiveness, motivation, supportiveness, and encouragement. And you can see the kind of end points of those scales on the slide there. In all cases, higher scores, higher numbers in anything that I show you from here on in means that they liked it, like it was more positive, it was more helpful, it was more clear, more good, right? In one way or another. The comments, I've talked about the fact that we presented 100 comments. Where did we get those 100 comments? They were real comments given by real markers on real reports. So what we did was to randomly select real reports from the previous 2 academic years before we started the research program. And what we would do is essentially we downloaded a list of all of the things that had been submitted, used a random number generator to pick a row. We opened that feedback and went through to extract in-text comments that had been left on that particular script. We extracted in-text comments without kind of altering them, as long as they were short-ish. We wanted nothing that was longer than 3 sentences, largely just because it would be easier to read and less time-consuming for the participants, but also because shorter comments are less likely to be specific to the topic or the theory that was in the assignment from which the comment was drawn. Okay, so we wanted these to be real feedback comments that were short and easy to read, but also transferable. And because if you have a very specific piece of feedback about a very specific aspect of one assignment, if the next assignment doesn't have that same specific topic or specific aspect, it's not going to be as transferable anyway, and that will affect our intention to use ratings. So once we'd gone through a randomly selected paper and pulled out the in-text comments that fit with these criteria, we then moved on to another randomly selected script and did the same. And we did that until we had the 100 comments that we needed. So again, just in case anybody is wondering, They were all anonymized. Nobody knew whose work it was that the comments were drawn from. Nobody knew the identity of the marker either. And these types of reports in Swansea are marked by big teams of people. So we had a range of different markers and a lot of different kinds of feedback. Okay, so that's the general materials for studies 1 to 3. The way that they differ is slight, but it's important to note them because it actually is quite helpful in terms of interpreting and applying the findings later on. So in study 1, our first swing at doing it, we selected all those comments. Participants saw them in a random order per participant, and they were presented with one comment written at the top of the page, and underneath they had to rate all of the 8 characteristics: the intention to use, the helpfulness, etc., etc. Once they'd done all 8 for that comment, they moved to the next comment, which again was randomly selected from the remaining pool. In study 2, we did kind of 2 things. One is that we added a definition of the characteristic. So rather than just saying how helpful is this, from very helpful to not at all helpful, we also said by helpful we mean that, and explained what we were considering a helpful comment to be, or helpful to be as a variable. We also changed the way that things were presented, so that rather than seeing a comment and rating all different characteristics, we now we're given one characteristic with definition, rated all the comments for that characteristic. Then we're given the definition of the next characteristic, rated all the comments for that. We also added in study 2 an additional outcome variable, which was based on the same intention to use thing. So we still had the intention to use in your next assignment, just as we had in study 1, but we added, if you were going to be allowed to redraft this work and submit it again, how likely would you be to use this particular feedback comment? And then study 3 was exactly the same as study 2, except that we included the definition and the redraft thing, but rated a comment for all characteristics, then the next comment. So essentially we've got 2 different ways of organizing the list, the ratings, which order you do the ratings in, and we've got with a definition and without. To analyze the data, we went through the same steps for each of those 3 studies. In each case, we calculated the mean ratings for each of the characteristics for each comment. We correlated those ratings across the core comments to check for reliability. Once we'd done that, we correlated the predictor variables with the intention to use variable, or the intention to redraft using this comment variable. And then we performed multiple regressions to see what successfully predicted intention to use of one type or another. In all cases, the core comment rating correlated at a minimum of 0.7. It's actually a minimum of 0.72, but 0.7 is enough. So there were very strong correlations between the ratings in each of the 4 randomly assigned groups of participants, and therefore we felt safe to assume that the ratings that were given on the other comments would also be representative of everybody. So in other words, our rating system, or the way that the participants were approaching the rating task, was reliable. It's also the case that the patterns that we saw in the correlations, obviously the numbers differed slightly, but the patterns were identical in all the studies. And so what I'm going to present to you on the next couple of slides is an analysis of the combined data sets. So we took the ratings from all 3 studies and put them together. So just had more participants basically doing the same thing. Right, let me just move that because I've got some people's faces over a part of the table now. So these are the results from that combined analysis. you have means and standard deviations of ratings here. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about these, but these are 7-point scales. So you can see that the means are slightly above the middle. What I haven't got here is the range of scores, but it was the case that people were using the whole scale. So that's good. Over this side, we've got correlations between the ratings on the various different characteristics, and also the future here is the intention to use on your next assignment, and the redraft is redrafting the same assignment to submit again. So these are our outcome variables at the bottom here. These are our predictors. The first thing I suppose that everyone's going to notice is that these correlations are pretty decent size, all of them. And in fact, they're all significant beyond P of less than 0.001. The next thing I hope that people will notice, because it's important for what's going to go on afterwards, is that there are some quite clear clusters here. So these three, the helpfulness, the constructiveness, and the clarity, correlate together very strongly. Still strongly with everything else, but less so. Okay. So we considered these three groups to be a kind of usefulness group of characteristics. Likewise, we have a group down here that correlate very, very strongly to each other and less strongly to the helpfulness, constructiveness, and clarity. So we consider this the niceness cluster. I'm using the word consider this because actually, because of the level of correlation between these things, when we tried to conduct a factor analysis, we got an error, an ultra Hayward case, which basically means that these things are so close together that the analysis doesn't work. It just won't do it. So we considered these three things to be one cluster and these to be the other. The other thing that obviously happens there, because of the level of overlap between, or level of strength of association between all the variables, is that if you put them all into a regression at once, you get problems with collinearity. So instead, what we did was to do a series of regressions in which we alternated one characteristic from the niceness group and one characteristic from the usefulness group. Okay, so we did that doing all possible combinations, which resulted in 12 different multiple regression models, each containing 2 predictor variables and an outcome variable. All of those models had very, very high R-squareds, adjusted R-squareds, I should say. Models accounting for a lot of the variance in the reported intention to use a given comment. And we can talk about that a bit later on if you want to, because there is to me, these numbers are perhaps too high to be believable, and maybe something else is going on, but we can talk about that later should you wish. The best model in terms of being able to predict intention to use for the next assignment included the helpfulness characteristic from the useful group and the motivational value from the niceness group. And that had an R-squared of 0.938. So there's lots and lots of variance being accounted for just by knowing how helpful a comment is and how motivating it was. Interestingly, though, in all of the models, nearly all of the models, the predictor that was added from the niceness group did not have a significant beta. So while it's involved in the successful model, it's not actually contributing anything in and of itself. That contrasts, though, with the data that we got from the, if you're going to redraft this, would you use the feedback? The same model, the same 2 predictors were involved in the most successful model, and that's not a typo. It did come out with the same adjusted R-squared. But in this case, we had significant beta related to motivation. And again, in all models, the thing from the niceness group had a negative beta. So the more motivating a comment was, the less likely people were to use it in redrafting their work. And the simple kind of interpretation or explanation for that might be that if you're going to redraft something, if you're getting a really kind of positive comment about it, likelihood is you don't need to redraft it. You've already got that bit right. So that's probably what that is. So from studies 1 to 3, we determined that clarity and helpfulness and constructiveness kind of go together. And so do supportiveness and motivational value and tone and encouragement. In the literature, there are studies relating to each of these things, except helpfulness, that seem to consider them as separate entities. Students don't seem to be making that distinction. So it is the definition of an academic distinction that we are making it as researchers, but that has no kind of real impact on the ground. And importantly, when we provided the definitions in studies 2 and 3 of what we meant by these various characteristics, it didn't make any difference. So the students still were considering the same things, the same clusters of things as being similar. It's also important to pull out that the patterns of what is important and what is predictive of intentions used changes for your formative feedback versus your summative feedback. In summative feedback, the niceness group isn't important at all, as long as things are nice and usable. In your formative feedback, being particularly nice reduces the likelihood of that comment being used. So, in answer to our research question, what is considered helpful? It appears to be that comments that are usable are the things that students would rate as helpful. So the more of that we do, the better chance we're going to have of getting a decent NSS score. We then moved on to asking, what is it that's considered fair by students? And in order to kind of do that, we considered some stuff from social psychology about justice, classroom justice, which I'll move on to in a moment. So just as again, kind of context, statistical context, I guess, staff tend to believe that they provide fair feedback, but the students don't always agree. So in this particular paper, all of the staff surveyed said, I provide fair feedback to my students, and only about, well, it was 2/3 to somewhere around 70% of the students said, I get fair feedback. So there's a disconnect there. And again, we're left with a question as to why. It's important because unfair feedback can be very demotivating to students, and it can, or what they perceive to be unfair feedback at least, and it can prevent them from engaging with the feedback process at all in anything. Beyond that, it can prevent engagement with the classes, and in some extreme cases, it can actually lead to various unpleasant things being directed towards the educators. At very least, students who think, or educators who are perceived to give unfair feedback are considered not to be very good at their job. It can get worse than that. But I'll leave it to you to look at the literature about that. And as I said, this relates to classroom justice, an idea of classroom justice. The perceptions of the assessment process and feedback fairness are related to justice, and there are 3 types that are kind of considered in this literature. There's the procedural justice aspect, which is basically, were the processes appropriate? Okay, was the assessment done under fair conditions? Did everybody have a decent chance to do well? Was it equitable in that way? Did the process of marking occur in the way that it was supposed to? And does the feedback that is received fit the grade that it goes along with it? We also have interactional justice, which has kind of 2 facets. One is about the quality of the information and the quantity of information that was provided. So if you're going to do an MCQ exam, it's important to know that you're doing an MCQ exam before you go in, and not go in expecting to be writing short essays under timed conditions, because the preparation is necessarily different. Was the other part of interactional justice is about the relationship between the educator, the teacher, and the student. Is there any bias there? Is there respect there? Is it appropriate? And then the final thing is distributive justice, which is basically to do with distributions of marks. Is it that the people who are smarter get the better marks, and the people who are not as smart don't get as good marks? Okay, that's essentially what it is. So those are the kind of three facets of classroom justice. And we considered that these might relate to fairness in relation to the characteristics of the feedback that we've already talked about in studies 1, 2, and 3. It's known from the literature that students consider clear and constructive feedback to be fair, based on if you ask them, that's what they tell you. And that makes a certain amount of sense, because in relation to interactional justice, you have correct information being provided by the giver of the feedback to the receiver of the feedback, relating to how well they've done and what they need to do to improve. It's accurate, clear information. In terms of procedural justice, it also makes sense because there's an obvious mapping between the feedback and the task. That's the clarity aspect, and that means that the process has worked. So we would expect usable comments to be considered to be fair as well. What's less known is the relationship between the niceness characteristics and fairness. But we considered that there might be an interactional justice element there. So things that are phrased positively are necessarily going to be more respectful. And that has to do with the quality of the interaction, the appropriateness of the interaction between the student and the teacher. The last thing that we decided to include in this fairness study was about the grade. So there is some research out there that considers how grade directly impacts fairness, perceptions of fairness. People who do well tend to think that the process must have been fair, generally, because it kind of serves them to think that. For those people for which there is a big discrepancy between the grade that they achieve and the expectation that they had, they believe there to be some unfairness going on there. It's not that they were kind of poorly calibrated and therefore expected a grade that was inaccurate. It's that the grade that was given isn't reflecting the actual effort and quality of the work that is handed in. So that we do know from the literature, but we don't know how that influences the feedback. So it's to do with kind of fairness of grades, but also the quality of the feedback outside of the grade, the qualitative comments. So we included that as well. So in study 4, we took some of the feedback comments that we used in studies 1 to 3, and we picked them based on being particularly high in, basically we collected comments that were either very high in usefulness on the ratings, very high in niceness, high in both of those things, or low in both of those things. And based on those comments, we extracted 10 kind of common issues that are highlighted in feedback, and wrote comments so that there were 4 different versions of each of those kind of comments related to the same common issues. That's a bit difficult to get your head around, so I'll just demonstrate with it, give you an example. One of the comments that we had in our studies 1 to 3 bank was this: good discussion of a key study, including this level of detail, helps with establishing the rationale. So what we have here, this was rated high on niceness and on usableness. And what we considered was that the good discussion of a key study was the nice bit, and including this level of detail helps establishing the rationale was the usable bit. It tells you why it was good. Okay, so you've got praise here and a reason for the praise. And that would mean that if we took out one part of it, so just left with good discussion of a key study, you would be left with a comment that was rated to be nice, but wasn't necessarily as usable. And if you took the other part out. So just including this level of detail helps with the rationale. That's useful. It tells you why it's that's been highlighted and what to do in future. So we've got that version as well. And then the final version, these were quite difficult to and uncomfortable, if I'm honest, to create. These were supposed to be neither nice nor usable, which wasn't to say that they were nasty, but it's just that they didn't have any praise in them, and they deliberately didn't really do much more than state something. So rationale, to us, that was an indication that that was the rationale part, good. But to a student, we don't know, they wouldn't necessarily know whether that is an indication that they've provided rationale or that they need to provide a rationale for why that statement is in there, etc. So that's neither nice nor usable. And we then presented those comments attached to one-page introductions to kind of mock journal articles. I wrote them both myself because I started this data collection before ChatGPT was really a thing. And so I spent a couple of days trying to write like a kind of average second-year undergraduate, which was quite tricky to do. Both introductions were on the same topic, so there wasn't going to be any influence there. There were 5 words different in their length, only 5 words out of 300 and some odd, so that's the same length. And I designed them to be worthy of a low 2-1. So there was stuff that they had done well and stuff that they could improve very obviously. These were presented to participants as kind of images of a Word document with the comment bubbles along the side, which had the feedback in order to try and replicate Turnitin in-text comments as best as we could without actually having to upload these things to Turnitin and make the comments on them. So participants in study 4 saw both those introductions, counterbalanced, of course. A participant would see either all comments that were nice and usable, or comments that were just nice, or comments that were just usable, or comments that were neither nice nor usable and never more than one. There were 5 comments attached to each of the introductions. And again, what was the one with the comments, each half of the comments was counterbalanced as well. One introduction, the participants saw the feedback and a grade. The other one, they just saw the feedback. So this was to try and determine whether the mark being there influenced the way that they perceived the feedback. And they had to rate the characteristics that we talked about before. I'll gloss over that because I'm going on a bit, but also fairness. So they also finally had to suggest a grade for whichever one of the introductions they saw that didn't have a grade on it. Essentially, the characteristics part was just to make sure that what I considered to be usable or nice were rated as being more usable and nice than the things that weren't supposed to be, and that worked. It's also the case that the same kind of features were rated as higher with intention to use, same as we'd seen before. Here's the important bit, the fairness ratings. So we've got fairness ratings up the side. This was on a scale that was 3 items, each out of 10 that added up. So this is out of a total of 30. And so you have grade being present or absent. You can ignore that because the presence or absence of a grade does absolutely nothing at all to any of the ratings and doesn't interact with anything else either. So we'll just forget that we did that bit. The key, though, is that the blue bars for the usable feedback are always rated as significantly higher than the orange bars for the not usable feedback. And if you look across from the nice and not nice bars, there is no difference there. So usable comments are rated higher for fairness. Fairness ratings are not affected by niceness at all or the presence of a grade. One thing that is influenced by niceness, though, is what grade the participants thought the introduction ought to get. So the nicer the feedback, the more likely it was that they would give a grade that was kind of higher up the scale than was actually accurate, basically. So we already said that comments that are usable are helpful. Comments that are usable are also considered to be fair. And so the kind of sum of this and I realize I'm rushing towards the end here, that's because I've just noticed the time, is we should strive to write usable comments. One, students are more likely to use them, which means that we'll fulfill the goal of the feedback in the first place. Second, they're more likely to rate them well for the helpfulness questions on the NSS and for the fairness questions on the NSS. But it's probably worth us being nice anyway, because, as I said, I generated these things to be of a kind of average standard. And therefore, the discrepancy between the feedback that was offered and the grade that was given is likely to be less than if I'd done kind of really nice comments with a really poor essay, or really usable comments, or sorry, really not nice comments with a really good essay. Right, I will stop talking now. Any questions?
Thank you very much, David, for this talk and for presenting your data. Yeah, so are there any questions for David in regard to, James, right, the talk and all the data? James, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. Like, me and some colleagues at Glasgow did something similar. So yeah, it's really nice to see some work on this. Just on this, like, last like, essentially on the implications, like, what, I can't remember if you mentioned it in the method part, but what would you consider like an unusable comment? Because for me, that seems like almost like the bare minimum. So I'm just wondering what you'd consider like an unusable comment. Like, so if we're thinking about convincing academics to kind of adopt this sort of thing to be more usable, to hopefully help students help themselves, how would you kind of explain the distinction between them?
Yeah, it's a good question. So from the ratings of the comments that we included in studies 1 to 3, what tended to happen was that things that were statements of fact without any kind of affectation or idea of whether things were positive or negative were not considered to be very useful. So a statement that, statement of citation, that could indicate that, yes, this is a citation, or it could indicate you need to include a citation, or it could be your citation isn't quite in the right format, or it could be a range of things all related to a citation. The marker, I don't believe that the marker would ever do it to not be useful, but it might not translate, and that's the bit that makes it unusable. So yes, being specific and directive is the thing that differentiated those two things, really. Saying why it was commented upon, or what you needed to do, what the purpose of that bit was. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions for David, or general thoughts triggered by the talk? I think one question that I would have is how to move forward from the findings, right? So what would be the next steps here? What would be the best way to use the findings and apply them in order for it to fall on fruitful soil? So what do you think?
Yeah, that's another good question. The one thing that I would like to do, and I don't have the expertise to do it, but maybe somebody here does, is to extend so we've got 100 comments, so we should extend that further. So we've got a massive corpus of comments that are rated for these niceness and usefulness things. And then from there, I think it would be really useful for us to do some kind of content analysis, or that kind of discourse type of analysis on it, to kind of extract what is it, what do useful comments have in common? Is it the way that they're phrased? Is it the length, the syntax, so when I was creating the nice versus not nice comments for study 4, I noticed that the things that were rated very high for niceness in our 100 comment kind of corpus all had the word good in them. That was it. There was one comment out of the whole 100 that had good in it that wasn't in the top 10 for, or the top, must have been 11 for niceness, and that was, this is not good practice. So the inclusion of the word good all of a sudden just went up you go, this is nice now. And that's actually what I used to create the manipulation. And lo and behold, in the manipulation checks, it works. That does seem to be sufficient to make things nice. Now, what I wasn't able to do was identify something equivalent for useful. But that, I think, would be something that you could do given a bit more kind of expertise with that type of analysis, or with a greater sample, a greater array of feedback on which to base that analysis. So that would be a next step for me, I think. And then we could create, as a community, a kind of a best practice a phrase bank equivalent of, if you want things to be useful, try phrasing them like this. That's it. Yeah, exactly like that. Something in the future you should.
Yeah, I think one thing that we have added in psychology quite for a while now, for quite a few years, is we have an overall comment section, and in there, the last bit is priorities for improvement section. So it's just 2 to 3 bullet points of what to focus on specifically from this assignment to the next assignment, right? To take that forward and to kind of create that digest for them, because very often I think it's difficult for students, or depends also on to be very honest, on the type of feedback provided. If it's very specific to that specific assignment without the outlook of how to use this in the future, it can be quite difficult to actually extract how to use this for the next assessment, because that's what we actually want students to do, right? And that's a quite difficult task to do if that feedback is very specific to specific exact aspects of that assessment, but we actually want them to extrapolate from that. So
yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that kind of has always struck me reading the literature and interacting with students and so on. Students like clear and unambiguous feedback, which is by nature going to be very specific. And actually the most useful feedback for them to have is probably that more abstract level of, in general, you should be trying to approach it in this kind of way so that you can use that abstract level in your next assignment, regardless of what it is. It's not the ones that this is that preference does not equal action thing that I was talking about right at the start. They prefer something that is by definition not going to be as transferable or as useful in helping them to improve the next time. And that's what the NSS is asking them about.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Yeah. I think as a team, we discussing quite many discussions about how to phrase these forward feedback items, right? And usually what we also add in there are, for example, links to resources, right? So, for example, if a student is struggling with APA style or any kind of how to write up a specific section coherently, we have links where they can see, oh, this is an example, right? So even the idea might be abstract, or the thing what we try to ask them to do is abstract. You can still find concrete examples to make it clearer what actually we are expecting. There is a question in the chat. I'll just try to find this by Kenneth. Is it better if feedback refers to a writing learning process rather than demonstration of learning a body of long knowledge?
I think the answer to that question is pretty much unequivocally yes, from the kind of pedagogical standpoint. But again, it's about matching that. So yes, right, the writing process is the thing that is going to be transferable and going to help people to improve across the course of their degree. It's not what they want. And that's the battle that we have to face, to fight, I think. It's also actually, and I was trying not to do this. I was trying to talk about feedback rather than assessment. But actually, some types of assessment, it's very difficult to give feedback that isn't about the demonstration of the knowledge, depending on how that assessment is set up. So yeah, there's a trade-off there, I guess, that you have to, if you want to be able to talk about the process, which I absolutely grant is probably the best thing. In fact, it's I did spot that somebody had talked about Winston and Nash's article that came out a little bit earlier this year, and that's one of the things that Naomi Winston is big on, is the feedback should be about the process. In fact, the assessment should be the process. Really, the thing that is handed in is to demonstrate that the process has been completed. Really, that is the better thing to do. But selling it to students, and selling it certainly to more traditional, I'll put it that way, more traditional academics, that's quite difficult to do. It's also very much tied, I think, in my experience, being able to do those kind of process reflective-y things is very hard to do when you're teaching on massive scales. And if you've got 300+ people doing any given assignment, it becomes very difficult to track the process that is the thing that you want them to be doing, because you simply haven't got the time.
I think you already picked up the article, Winston and Nash. Maxine had a follow-up question regarding that, and she asks, where do you see your findings sitting in this framework?
That's a good question.
That's Maxine. Sorry, Maxine here. Hello.
That is a very good question. Let me be honest, I've read that paper in July, and I can't remember it now exactly what it was, but if I remember rightly, there were various kind of aspects of that framework to do with kind of again, process rather than output, I think, really. Maxine, can you remind me what the framework was so that I can answer your question?
Yeah, of course. And it's, admitting I just sort of reading this paper last week, so it was, I could remember it reasonably well. I think they had the diagram, and they used a descriptive framework of research questions to ask about mechanisms involved in feedback. You know, kind of using like an approach that you have in terms of a more psychological science approach. And there was desire, how much do they want the feedback, attend, how do they receive or absorb the feedback, appraise, do they think it's useful, elaborate, do they can consider it more deeply, revisit, will they go back to it and adjust, will they adjust their performance?
Yeah, so some of those kind of key questions there are things that we've touched on, even if not fully, you know, maybe not in the extent that it's talked about in that paper, but we have kind of talked about some of those things. Yeah, I'd have to revisit that paper to be able to give you a full answer. But I do completely agree with the premise of the paper that actually there's a lot we can do in relation to feedback and assessment to make it useful, and a lot of research that actually, it's one of those things when you do this kind of research, I don't know if anybody else has, but I come up with ideas and then I kind of assume that people have already done them, and then I'm surprised to find that they haven't been done. So something as simple as you know, asking people, would you use this feedback, that doesn't happen that often, which seems to be really low-hanging fruit. So in that regard, I think that Winston and Nash paper does set out a really nice kind of roadmap for where we should go. How I fit into it, I don't know, but hopefully somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Steve, a quick question because we're running out of time, but you have your hands up, so feel free to ask.
Well, a couple of things. On a small scale, I did go through a phase of getting students to sit down with me and their feedback and fill in a simple form about what they would do with it. And that actually, without me urging this, it made a big difference to them spending a few minutes actually converting a judgment into action. So that's a comment on one side on that miniature. The other comment I had, though, you and Carolina were both agreeing that you somehow ought to be commenting on the process. The thing that made me feel completely stumped in that respect was at one point in thinking about feedback, I thought, well, what's the simplest thing I could think of? It would be correcting a spelling error. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to be different in that, what do I have to do? And I realized there were at least 3 mental processes I had to change. One was recognizing correct versus incorrect differently. The second was in generating writing, I have to fix my generator of the spelling. And it's quite possible how those different. And thirdly, I've forgotten what the third one was, but the point is, I think for the simplest possible part of the process, actually, it turns out there may be 3 sub-processes which have to be separately corrected internally, which makes it quite hard to be optimistic and have a practical strategy straight away.
Yes, well, that's very true. But that's an excellent example. I guess my riposte to that would be, who cares? On that about spelling, right? Yes, spelling's important. We want people to spell properly, and that would be great. But is that going to be the thing that really determines what their grade is? Probably not. It's the same as when you're coming up to the kind of final deadline for things, and you get emails from students saying, does it have to be Times New Roman 12 point? Well, maybe officially it does, but that if you do a blinding essay and you do it in Calibri 11, I'm not going to say you fail. So I don't care about that. What I care about is, have you structured an argument properly? Have you used evidence appropriately? Are you evaluating things? Are you have you interpreted your statistics correctly? Those kinds of things are the processes then that are more important in determining the grade. And again, you are right that there will be multiple bits within that. But I guess the more kind of abstract the process is, the more abstract you can be about it, I think. Maybe that's a stupid thing to say, but...
No, that's true. It's just that the Winston emphasis on thinking about the process, if that actually needs this complicated elaboration at the very simplest kind of feedback, what hope is there for proceeding down that in a practical way for more important things, which, like you, I would think would be our main object. So that was that.
Yeah, it is a good question. One thing, I think about these things and think that would be a really great idea, but it's completely impractical. Ideally, what you want students to be doing is what we do when we write papers. Okay, so never do I ever go, right, it's the 28th of September, I've got up, I've had my breakfast and my morning cup of coffee, I'm going to submit a paper by the end of the day. I'm going to write it all at once and then I'm going to send it off. We don't do it that way. We think about it, we talk about it with other people, we do a little draft, we redraft it, maybe we give a talk about it to an interested group of people to get their feedback to help us to hone our ideas. That's the process of writing, academic writing. What we would want students to be doing is demonstrating that they are using similar kinds of iterative, reflective processes to generate their essays. Not just let's pick 5 papers from the first 2 pages of Google Scholar and base it entirely on that and do it all in this one night. That's not what we wanted to do. So if you could structure assessment where, I think it would probably have to be semester long or program level or something like that, but people would say, right, in this week, what did you do to work towards this final piece of work, this final assignment? Well, I read these papers and I sorted them in this way. Okay, great. That's a useful first step. What did you do in the next week? What did you do in the week after? Supporting people through that process would be incredibly arduous and time consuming. And again, would work quite well if you were maybe a small program with 10 or 12 students in it, but won't work if you've got even 20 or 30 because you just simply don't have the time. But I guess that's the process as I see it. The process that we're trying to assess is the way you get from point A to point B, and not what point B is.
Okay, all right. We had actually, while you were explaining, a couple of more comments in the chat, which is good because they are on the recording now as well. So thank you. All right. I would like again to thank you, David, for your talk,
Very welcome.
and for sharing your findings and your research. And I wish you good luck with the next steps there as well.
Thank you.
And hope to see you all back at our next tile event in October. Thank you very much, and bye.